Third down and 20.
So this was an interesting thread that I found on Reddit, which is something that I've kind of been saying a lot of the offseason and have really put to use in our Dynasty League, the one that we're all in. And the Reddit post is titled Player Valuation Fallacies by L. Burninator.
Yeah,
a Lions fan.
For him.
Apparently people know him, the Dynasty movement. I think either him or someone else is part of the Dynasty process trade calculator. But his general argument is that the top players in Dynasty leagues are kind of overvalued, right? Like the price difference between one of his examples was Nick Chubb to Kareem Hunt just isn't worth paying, and it isn't worth the amount of fantasy points that is differentiated in between the two of them compared to the price, right? So he brings up that. He brings up D-Hop to Tyler Lockett and Robert Woods, that D-Hop is worth 11% more than Tyler Lockett and Robert Woods combined, but the difference in fantasy points is like, I think he brings it up here. Something like he brings up 4 points here. I don't know exactly where it is, but general theory is, why the hell are you paying this premium price for the top players when you could be picking up the Robert Woodsons and the Tyler Lockett's and pocketing the difference? And I actually really agree with that, because that's something I've been trying to do. But I don't think necessarily selling the top tier players is the correct way to phrase it. I think it's more selling on the hype, right? When players have that hype, that, and to some extent the top tier because they have the name value, right? But it's just like, you take a player A and a player B. Player A has hype. Player B does not have hype. But they're generally speaking the same player, right? In terms of like a short-term outlook. And I mean, he brought up Tyler Lockett. That's probably a pretty good example to someone like T. Higgins, right? Even though everyone knows T. Higgins for the long term, I'd rather have him. And you have all these people, oh, if you're a rebuilder, T. Higgins. Oh, if you're a contender, Tyler Lockett. Just that lazy freaking take. But I really love doing this, especially for receivers. Just selling off of the hype, pocketing the difference. Using that difference to stonk even more and more and more until all of a sudden you have a ton of value and you still have a competing team. So why do I do this for receivers, though? Because the longevity is not priced in for the older receivers. When you look at Tyler Lockett, Robert Woods, I don't think is a great example. Cooper Kupp, all these 27, 28, 29-year-old stud receivers, you're saying, oh, well, they only got 1 or 2 good years left? That's it. But then you look at T. Higgins, you say, oh, well, he's got 7 years left. Regardless of whether that's true or not, you are taking the longevity factor of wide receivers, something that has been proven basically by the data analytics, and betting on it just on the tail end, and then getting a ton of value to then go in and then pick more good young receivers. The one thing that I will say about this, though, because, listen, I've been doing this all the time, right? Taking hyped players and trying to sell into veteran players, the non-hyped players, the non-flashy players that get points, pocket the difference. There's a line in the sand between a real stud and a non-stud. A real just Tyreek Hill or a Justin Jefferson, where it's just not worth doing this. Right, where it's not worth saying, oh, I'm going to go from player A on the hype to player B and pocket the difference. So I love this strategy. I'm curious to hear what you guys are thinking about it. I'm adapting this in all of my leagues. After those players, I draw the line in the sand. Like Nick Chubb, I'm not going to do it for. Justin Jefferson, I'm not going to do it for. But everyone else, yes.
I mean, I think it's a fantastic strategy, because I think a lot of Dynasty players get caught up in this age factor that you brought up. You know, a lot of players, they look at D-Hop and they go, oh, he's 29 years old. He only has 1 or 2 years left. He's not worth that of a T. Higgins, who has never once put up the numbers that D-Hop has put up year in and year out. In any year he's played 16 games, I think he's been a top 10 wide receiver or something like that. He's been incredible for 7, 8, 9 years. And there's really no slowing down, especially now that he's tied with Kyler Murray. And he's the guy that you could probably, like Frank said, stonk into. I mean, maybe not as easily just because, he is a big name wide receiver, but to pocket the difference. And like Frank said, then you just reload on those young wide receivers, they gain hype again, and you could sell them off for veterans again and more picks. And it's just a cycle that continues, and it really keeps your team, your draft picks, you keep piling up, and your team stays pretty much relatively the same, just because guys like Cooper Kupp, as we've seen this year, you probably could have got him in the offseason for maybe a first-round pick. I mean, definitely a first-round pick, but not much more than that. And he's receiver 1 right now. I know it's only 3 weeks, but, he's a great example of this.
JT and Lounis, I'll let you guys go, but I just want to clear the air for a couple of things on this. First off, I really do not recommend doing this method from going from one hyped young player to another. It can definitely work, but I do think to a certain extent you have to have guys that you really believe in. I use a 0-1-2 system where it's just like, okay, twos are twos, man. I believe in them through and through, and I mean, I'm just going to value them way over consensus. And if I'm going from a 2 to a 1, it's not worth pocketing the difference. I think you can really fall for the bait doing that, going from a Justin Jefferson to a Chase Claypool. Like, I think that there are people that could talk themselves into doing something like that when that's a massive bait. And the other thing I will say is you gotta, I think the best way to do this is going for the consensus underpriced players. Dude, we all knew coming into the season that guys like Adam Thielen and guys like Keenan Allen are underpriced. But when you try to buy them straight up, they're impossible to get because the owner just wants more than they're worth. The only way you're going to get them is by giving them that flashy, shiny object. Mm-hmm. And then last thing, I think this is really, you could do it with other positions, but I think receivers is where it really pans out. JT, as you were saying.
I think you guys get close to being to what I agree with, but then it kind of just misses, especially that last point, Frank. I think the flashy players are the best ones to move around, in my opinion, moving from flashy young guys to flashy young guys, right? Because A.J. Brown is someone that I would be trying to move around before if I could. A.J. Brown for DJ Moore in a first, A.J. Brown for T. Higgins in a first, A.J. Brown for maybe Chase Claypool in a first. That's about as far as I go. If I'm picking a first-round pick on top of A.J. Brown, I like A.J. Brown, but a lot of his production did come from touchdowns. There were reasons why to be worried about A.J. Brown. And it's just I'm getting still this young, flashy receiver that I like, and I'm getting a first-round pick on it. That's something I would do. Justin Jefferson is kind of where I might draw the line. Him and Patrick Mahomes, and I'm trying to think, Kyler. There are certain top-tier players that I'm not going to want to do this with. But even Lamar Jackson, I was trying to do it with Lamar Jackson 2 years ago when I thought Lamar Jackson was getting overvalued. He was quarterback 2. And I reached out to Lounis, and this was before Kyler Murray went off, and I was like, hey, I'd give you Lamar Jackson for Kyler in a first. I mean, Lounis didn't do it, but I'm sure in many other leagues that's a trade that would happen because you will go on the
Lamar just came off his MVP season.
Yeah. So I think these flashy big name players, you can move them for players that are similar values. Obviously, there are times I guess you can get burnt, but that's if you're going after the wrong prospects. If you're going after the wrong, there are certain Najee Harris is a guy that I didn't like. If you're trying to move Jonathan Taylor for Najee Harris in a first, that's not something I advocate for. It's something that you could have almost certainly done, not something I would advocate for. So there's kind of just this keep in mind, figure out who the good prospects are or whatnot, and go get those guys for the flashy guys. I don't know. That's just how I run it.
I agree with that. I think that for me personally, it's easier to fall into the bait when you're giving up a Nick Chubb and saying, oh yeah, I'm getting back whoever, Najee Harris, maybe like you said, or David Montgomery or Clyde Edwards-Helaire or Mixon. And that's not a gap that I think is worth taking the value, whereas I think it's a lot easier to pull off at the receiver position where, it's similar where you have 4 guys, 5 guys that way outscore everyone else. But, wide receiver 11 to wide receiver 24 is generally a pretty small gap, and that's the gap that I like to stonk instead of trying to play the game of, oh, I'm going from QB2 to QB7 and seeing if it pans out. Like, yes, if it in my system, if I'm going from a 2 to a 2 and pocketing the difference, I'll do that. But I don't think that everyone's going to be able to do that successfully. So I don't want people to get burned.
Yeah, so the thing I'll say about this strategy, this is something where, like, this can be extremely effective, but you really have to know your shit. Like, this is one of those where you have to know where to draw the line in certain tiers of players. I think people, everyone here, because we've been playing Dynasty for a few years, is capable of doing it. But I think if someone is kind of just getting into Dynasty and hasn't, like, had experience with, like, how these tiers can shake up year to year, how easily certain guys can go up and down, you don't want to fall into the trap of, I saw as one of the comments on the post, which was a good point, where you're like, oh, these two players combined are better than this one player, or these two assets. But at the end of the day, like, him producing close to both of their production in one slot in your starting lineup, that gives an advantage. Yeah. So that's where I say is where you kind of have to be smart and experienced with it, where it's like you know where to draw the line so that you're not in that situation with certain tiers of players.
We gave rosy examples, I feel like, that we were aligned with, right? These were moves that we would have done, each move that we said. But there are ways, like, you could have gone and got Julio or Ayuk right now, and you'd be feeling a little bit burnt. I mean, obviously, times will change, and who's to say we're still only 3 weeks in. But there are ways that you could certainly get burnt if you're not following closely what's going on.
I completely agree, and that's why when I said this initially, I'm like, that's why I want to avoid some of the more younger, uncertain players, just because you're minimizing your chance of being burnt. And like, okay, Julio is a player that you could do it for, but what I mentioned was, I mean, I want to go for those undervalued 26, 27, 28-year-olds. The Tyler Lockett's, I think, is just a good example. And that's a guy I wasn't necessarily high on at the beginning of the offseason, but by the end, I was trying to scoop up shares. And, you know, it's like in the startup drafts video that we did, the pseudo vets, like a Deebo Samuel. Once again, a rosy example, but he's a dude that was a super young player, not being valued like a super young player.
Yeah, I mean, we're gonna look like, I don't know. We're sniffing
Mike Williams, though. Mike Williams is one.
Yeah, he's someone we want.
He could have been a great one. None of us bought him. That would have been a good buy. Even Hollywood, the pseudo vet. Like, Hollywood had like a shitty, he had a shitty game, dropped a couple passes. But if you had him in your lineup, you're probably pretty happy.
Yeah, I'm still out on Hollywood. But yeah, I mean, for the most part, I feel like we hit it right this year. I don't know if that's just luck or whatnot. I'm going to go with his skill.
But even now, really I think Jarvis Landry's a dude that, I mean, I wouldn't go from a really sick receiver into him unless I'm getting a ton of value, but you can kind of, he's a dude that you could buy at a good price, and I think when he comes back, he's going to be pretty consistent.
I mean, I think Odell's even another one.
I think Odell. I was about to say Odell and Sutton were two examples of those last offseason. You forgot Sutton is still young
Kenny
and
G,
just had like 1,000-yard receiver.
I mean, I think the Giants' offense.
I think it's more he's getting fucked by that offense.
Yeah.
All right. Let's
Corey Davis.
I like Corey Davis.
Of an offense.
Scrapping the barrel a little bit.
Corey Davis is someone I would have been. Corey Davis and Juju are two players I would have been trying to do this method with, and right now I would not be loving.
Yeah, but the last thing though, too, JT, it's not like going and buying Cooper Kupp or Lockett or whatever was rocket science. Like, these guys were top 24 receivers for a lot of the most previous years. It's not like you were buying someone unproven.
That's true.
Like, if you're going for a crazy maneuver where you're projecting a guy that's been finishing like way up and down the standings to all of a sudden be consistent for the next 2 years, that's where you get burned.